start talking. I'll start talking while they send up their presentation, so we don't lose more time. You're a very good audience. I'll be back from the little break we had. Next, this is the final block of this summit. I think we're all ready for the last bit. Tired, will be tired at the end, we are satisfied. Anyway, the next panel is about, what is it about? Sorry. I should read that better. Oh yeah, the museum, I don't know how to pronounce it. Anyway, Divisionalizing the museum. And it's Nathalie Laveng who will present this live, and we have some people that I know from the archives, at least Lisa Beigel, I know her, she's all over there, ISEA Archive, and the other two remote presenters are Bruno Maresci and Rafael Badazzini, I think. Did I say that right?
Yeah.
Good. Take it away.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you. Gracias. Gracias. Thank you very much for the introduction, and good evening, good afternoon, almost evening, everyone. So I'll start this panel giving a presentation, sharing some thoughts about what we are calling the demusealization, the idea of demusealization of the museum, which is a concept that we are wrapping together. That my own research in my PhD dissertation about the musealization of the museum space and the sharing of these images on social media, and also it's a common approach of the Giselle, Bruno, and Rafael Pagattini artistic research practice. So a possible definition of musealization is an operation of trying to extract physically or conceptually something from its natural or cultural environment and giving it a museal status. I'm quoting André Desvalets and François Marais in Key Concepts of Museology. They also clarified how the act of musealization leads the museum away from being a temple to make it part of the process, which brings it closer to a laboratory. So from this idea, I'm using the notion of musealization for three different moments. The first one is originated in the memory studies discussion in the 80s, when we started to hear about the musealization of daily life as part of the debate about the memory boom and the archive fever. The second one is what I'm calling the musealization of the museum, which started to happen mostly since 2012, more or less, when most museums started to allow visitors to photograph inside the galleries. And the third moment would be what we are calling the demusealization of the museum. And I'm choosing this temporal mark in 2016, basically because it's correlated to other recent events, such as the creation of some movements such as the colonized displays, which help to bring this debate to a wider audience. And one of the reasons is to the repercussion on social media. In this debate about the memory boom in the 80s, Andreas Hewson is one of the authors who devotes special attention to the protagonist of the museum, which was actually an opposite movement concerning the battle against the space assumed by the avant-garde movement in the early of the 20th century, and again in the 60s. And this is perhaps still one that's very symbolic images of our archive fever in the recent decades. This work by Eric Castles, 24 hours in photos. It was presented right in several occasions in which he materialized the total number of photos published in a single day on platforms such as Flickr, Facebook, and Google Images. A recent version was shown recently in the exhibition Send Me an Image in the CO Berlin, occupying the hall of the museum with 350,000 photos posted on Flickr 50 years ago. But he chose he chose to remake the installation by downloading the images from the networks of the present time. It would be difficult to find a suitable space. How many more square meters would it take to stock some 90 million printed downloads, the approximate number of images posted daily on Instagram in December last year? But actually, this work is translating another moment in what some authors, such as Andrew Hoskins, calls a third memory boom, which is different from the documentary overdose of previous decades basically because this characteristic that everyone is producing, transmitting their own memories in real time and in involuntary way, creating this process of a technological unconscious in which invisible operations of such software and algorithms are also playing important role. In other words, the problem is no longer just the obsession with archiving, but the difficulty to understanding when and how and for whom we are producing memories. So, if the musealization of everyday life is one of the consequences of the memory culture, it is interesting to think about what happens when this space also becomes a target of such practice. When visitors started to photograph the artworks and post these images online, they also assume a new role musealizing the museum itself. The word museum is mentioned around in a hashtag with this word 23 million times in a search on Instagram. Mm-hmm. In a moment when the definition of what a museum is and its role is in question, it doesn't seem possible to arrive to a clear answer by looking at such diverse sets. At first glance, the only thing that we can conclude is that the definition of museum on Instagram visual culture is getting closer to every dimension of life, from fitness to soccer. And a second step after this musealization of the museum would be how these images are shared on platforms such as Instagram, becoming kind of a digital personal collection or counter collection. This term was used to describe an emergent archive and musealization beyond the academia and outside the institutional tradition of memorization practice. And it is used by researchers such as Cícero Inácio da Silva as a response to a long and historical process of formalization, a counter methodology. This is an example of some hashtags mapping people on social, on museum space, which are several kind of different keywords to find this material, or at the same time that to research the same material on museums is not sometimes easier because museums don't have a particular category to organize images of visitors, which is sometimes problematic because I'm trying to collect this material and it's very dispersed. And among this counter collection created by the audience, I'm grouping some images that correspond to the idea about the demusealization of the museums. Because if museums are on spotlight very much in this moment when the emergence of the debate about the colonial reparation, follow how audiences responding to this process in digital platform is certainly a topic time. Here, these two visitors, for instance, are refusing to look at the artworks, which is already an interesting manifesto against the site-centered regime of experience in museums. And both are using elements of the museum space to perform for the camera. But there are deeper messages behind that which could be seen as funny picture. They're also questioning the lack of representation of some bodies and identities in the museum imaginary. So the process of demusealizing the museum certainly has gained more popularity in the last few years with the rise of groups such as the Colonized Displays in 2016. The main members are Palestinian American Amin Hussein and the Indian American Natasha Dishlam, which besides being activists are also artists and academics. And in an article written in 2018 for the October magazine, they contextualized their actions among one of the phases of the institutional critique, pointing as a difference the fact that they use more social movement tactics, seeking dialogues with other sectors of society. And because I have these origins in the Occupy movement in 2011, when it started as a part of the Occupy Museum, which was the beginning kind of activism on social networks. The use of these platforms are also very central in this in their actions. Just doing a short retrospective for this recent event, and 2020 was also a central year to this debate, especially due to the scope of the Black Lives Matter protests, which was the largest in the history of the United States, and in parallel, combined with the urban follies movement. And both movements also had an impact on the growth of the debate of the museum decolonization, especially in the case of ethnological and natural history museums, with collections that have their origins in colonial process. And so this is just to introduce a topic about the Humboldt Forum, which is a case study that I'm working on in my PhD thesis. And considering all these recent episodes that could not have been a more troubled historical moment for a museum like Humboldt Forum to open, and as it was last year after years of delay. And since it started to be planned, it has been accused of being rooted on conservative ideas that goes against what is understood as a modern Germany, and especially due to the reconstruction of the Berlin Palace, bringing back a nostalgia of the Prussian imperialism. And as a way, well, besides that, the institution also incorporates the so-called non-Western art, such as the Berlin Asian Arts Museum, Ethnological Museum, and the Humboldt University Scientific Collection. And as you know, there are several controversies concerning provenance and cultural appropriation in this collection. And as a way to respond to this controversy, the Humboldt Forum have appropriated post-colonial critique as a strategic reflexivity, to use a definition by Friedrich von Boos. And it's an interesting case study of a museum that was open while demusealizing itself, using the logo decolonized as a brand in its publicity material. And this was an artistic research collaboration between the artist Ted Antler with the Humboldt Lab as part of the Making Difference project. This is something that we can discuss later in the roundtable, because it's also dealing with ethics a lot. Actually, the artists created an art installation for the exhibition After Nature that asks visitors and professional communities to consider the ethical implication of exhibiting human remains that belongs to museums and university collection. And basically they decided not to exhibit the skull, but they created a discussion about why do not exhibit. But interestingly, they use the images of the skull and the museum publicity material on the website. And I'm also reproducing here. Yeah. In my research, I'm basically doing a comparative analysis between the hashtag Humboldt Forum on Instagram and the museum official account. I'm looking for points of convergence and difference between demusealization practice carried out by the audience and by the institution itself. Also trying to identify new taxonomies about the museum and the collective memory created. I'm interested to discuss how the remediation of the museum and through images could be used in different ways, and sometimes opposite ways, either to reinforce a traditional socially constructed imaginary about this space, either to dismantle. And just, I'm not going further on this, but just to say that I use a similar methodology in this other research about the National Museum in Rio de Janeiro, which is part of a chapter that I also, for a book that I also wrote with Giselle Begeman. And it addressed the emergence of an involuntary memorial to the Rio de Janeiro National Museum on Instagram since the fire that happened in 2018 and destroyed around 46% of its collection. And so during 1 year, we analyzed approximated 1,700 posts, 1,000 posts which use the hashtag Museu Nacional Vive, which means Museu Nacional is alive, trying to identify patterns among these images that could be conceptualized as a memorial, like an involuntary memorial created by people concerning the lack of politics for memory preservation and the discussion, and that is very particular in Brazil and Latin America. And so, yeah, the idea to approximate a Humboldt Forum, I also create this, I tried to create some, using images of both museums. I create an Instagram account, trying to find some points in common of the both institutions have an origin in imperial, have an imperial past in this origins. But yeah, I think this would be too much time specific. I can comment about this later on the ethics on the round table. And just to show a little bit of these categories again about the Humboldt Forum. And one of these categories that I'm creating is just using like the idea of collective writing, comparing the hashtags with the with some manifestations that people are doing with graffitis in this space, basically combining opposite discourse. This on the left was an old images that I found from, I think just for when it was announced that the palace would be reconstructed, and actually celebrating that the palace would be reconstructed again, combining with this recent protests asking its destruction. So yeah, I'm just going to show some of them, but not. This is also another category, which is related with this also, again, this idea of demusealizing the museum space using body visuality and the performative gaze, and which also the museum is using this a lot by inviting performance and dance exhibition in the museum. So it is from different approach by the audience and the museum. This is something that is kind of a trend at the moment. And yeah, so, and just to conclude, I just would like to say that the idea of the demusealization of the museum reverberates a current discussion about what many people are calling the post-museum, especially regarding ethnological museum. And as we see in these recent publications, the topic about the future of the museum is quite popular now, especially after or still in the pandemic. But what I think that more than a post-museum would suggest an idea of overcoming this concept. We are more interested in thinking about the notion of after museums, looking at other stages in which museumization process keep happening, such as that's images and circulation on social media and or in public space. And yeah, to conclude, I just would like to go back to the initial point about these three phases of musealization, adding two questions. One is how museums could learn with this counter methodology developed by the audience and assimilate this practice in their own institutional methods. And the second one would be how the audience itself can apply this demusealization practice in their own life. Actually, I mean, to be more conscious about the way we use social media as a platform, as archive in a more attentive and critical way, which basically is related also to digital literacy and how can this process be less unconscious and more, critical. Yeah, then I think that's it. I will finish and then thank you. I'll let the time for the other presenters to keep and then we can discuss this more later.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes. Okay. Thank you all. I don't know if Natalia needs to stop the sharing. I can start sharing my screen. Yeah. Okay. Thank you all. Thanks, Natalia, Bruno, and Gisele. It's a pleasure to be here. Several artists, by understanding the museum as a space of conflict, have claimed to their practice new policies of operation as well as of funding for cultural institution. In this sense, they seek to rethink the structures and institutional policies of the museum in relation to its past. Here, I include my own contribution. I have been developing since 2014 an investigation of how the memory of civil military dictatorship from 1964 to 1985 in Brazil reverberates in Brazilian present in cultural space, and how many of the stories of the period are still silenced. I analyze how cultural space suffered directly or indirectly with the problems and contradictions of producing culture in times of state of exception. Thus, I chose, among other institutions, the Pinacoteca do Estado de São Paulo, because it is a public museum influential in locating the country's rich estate. In addition, São Paulo lived throughout 1970s and 1980s the process of consolidating its economic hegemony as cultural hegemony. Here, I present my research at the Pinacoteca do Estado de São Paulo and how I approach the museum's collection give the possibility of online carrying. The investigation is one of the most important, the institution is one of the most important art museums in Brazil. It is the oldest art museum in São Paulo, founded in 1905. Besides being such a relevant cultural institution, the focus on the Pinacoteca is due to the annex building, called Pina Estação, former building of the DOPS SP, Department of Political and Social Order, was the political police that persecuted, tortured, and killed opponents during the dictatorship. Although most of the Pinacoteca's archives are not digitalized, I began my research consulting the online database. The museum provides us access to the information through the websites of their documentation and memory center. To long search for keywords in cross-referencing, I found the indication of files that were part of a box from the Gestão de Acervos Culturais, Management of Cultural Archives, in which there was a mention from 1973 to the former dictator Emílio Garrastazu Médici. This search on the online database along the carried the conducted with a sizable number of keywords and time frames. However, although the set of files was found, the material was not digitalized. That was when I went to Pinacoteca to have the access to the archives. Documentation indicates that a visit by the dictator took place on the occasion of the museum's reopening after a period closed for renovation. During the visit, Médici would have been especially interested in the painting Fim de Romance by the early 20th century artist Antônio Parreiras. The painting caught the general attention in 1973. Walter Ney, who was the director of the museum, hired a painter to make a copy with the aim of offering it to the general. In the files I found, there are documents referring to the whole process. The expansion of bidding, commitment, hiring, and payment, including the curriculum vitae of the painter who produced the copy. It draws attention to the fact that during the period of persecution of opponents of the regime, the painting was executed by a black painter, Otávio Ferreira de Araújo, who was trained in Moscow as an expert in socialist realism. It is worthwhile to speculate what would have caught the military man's attention. The dead man in typical costume of Metz region, would it have led him to find an affinity between the painting in his personal history a year before he left the government? In any case, the choice of painting is curious, to say the least, considering that it was during his government that dozens of opponents were killed and tortured. The general's sensibility seems to reflect the deceased during his government, many of whom passed through the DOPS headquarters, today an exhibition space of the Pinacoteca do Estado de São Paulo. The Pinacoteca, as an important institution administered by the state of São Paulo, is established as a cultural space brewed in army green barrels. Metz's enthusiasm for the painting and the contradictions inherent in this process of producing a copy demonstrate how the cultural space was constituted as a relation space between the agents that administered the dictatorship. This investigation also consulted the catalog file of Fim de Romance, which did not indicate the presence of the copy given as a gift to the general. After my visit, information about the existence of the documents, as well as the copy, was included in the catalog files of Parreira's work. Here, we have an important move in the institutional infrastructure of the Pinacoteca's collection. The gesture of including this information in the catalog file adds to Parreira's work and to the institution's collections new path, analysis, and disputes. Based on this research in the archives, I also developed a set of work as part of the investigation process, which starts by photographing the painting, taking advantage of the fact that the work was on display. I photographed the painting with macro lens, allowing the observation of details of the brush strokes, cracks, and fissures. These photographs serve as a basis for the formalization of the work. Thus, based on the Parreira's brush strokes and the fragments that make up the image, it would be possible to observe the painting's dormant memory, which can be read differently from the documents. The photographs were digitally edited on the computer to create a regular grid that was manually engraved into the wood. The choice of wood plates observed the constructions of the fibers and the design of the texture they create in the print. This noise brought to the printing image the contrast between the rigidity of the engraved line and the expressiveness of the wood. The process of reproducing the image based on a painting has been widely used in the history of art, including by photographic processes. Here, one can think how digitalization affects the communication and practice of the museum, even considering the still limited access to the institution's archives. The still act of starting an ordinary online carry enable me to build more discursive layers about specific work present in the institution collection. Therefore, it seems momentous for the institutions to make the most of digital technology implementation and wield it to enhance transparency policies and public access to all the information that derives the museum existence. In this sense, digitalization, or the so-called deep mediatization, can contribute to a deeper transformation of the practice of access to information, critical analysis of the museum's history, its collection, and communication. The developed work brings more question than answer on how the culture, despite creative visuals about the dramas of the dictatorship, build the relationships that still linger obscure with authoritarian governments. Based on this research, I question how much this proximity contributes to create a sense of institutional normality in Brazil during the dictatorship, marked by violence and torture, or if it was structured as a survival strategy for a fragile art system reliant on the state, a debate that remains ignited in the challenges encountered in contemporary times. By accessing the information structure regarding the history and memory of the institution through the consolidation of files and other material available online, this data is a structuring part of the museum and can even contribute to new discursive layers about the artwork in the collection and the cultural space itself. Thank you.
Hello, everybody. I will share my screen here. Just a moment. Is it okay? Everybody can see the slides?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. So my presentation here will be with Gisele Bergman. I will start and then she will continue. We'll change the positions during the presentation. So here we want, I and Gisele, we want to present a specific project. It's a project, Decomposite Collections. And it is a project that thinks about how museums and their collection can use technology and artificial intelligence from no commercial logics beyond the discourse imposed by big techs. So the Composite Collection is an ongoing investigation into the formation and updates of the colonialism gaze in museum collections. It's developed in the context of the Intelligence Museum residency in ZKM Museum. And the starting point is two art collections organized in the first half of the 20th century in São Paulo, Brazil. And so the team for this project is composed of 3 researchers: Gisele Bergman. She's an artist and professor at the Faculty of Architecture and Urbanism at the University of São Paulo. Myself, Bruno Moreschi, artist and postdoctoral fellow at the same faculty, and Bernardo Fontes, creative programmers at the Group on Artificial Intelligence and Art, Gaia, also at the University of São Paulo. Our main questions in this project are, so first, what other art histories might emerge from AI's readings? Then also, how to elaborate methodologies based on AI to map the elements of the representations of historical colonialism. And also, can AI systems contribute to understand the gaze as a historical construct? So to answer these questions, we analyze the collections of 2 important Brazilian museums, both from the University of São Paulo. The first one, the Paulista Museum, it's a historical museum, and the second one is the Contemporary Art Museum, MACBA. So Paulista Museum, it was founded in 1995 as a natural historical museum, and which became a historical museum in the context of the commemorations of the first centenary of Brazil independence in 1922. So today, the institution has a collection of over 450,000 items, and its collection is essential for understanding the construction of our colonialism imaginary in the official Brazilian historiography. And the other museum is the Museum of Contemporary Art, MACBA. It was created in 1963 when the University of São Paulo received the collection of the Museum of Modern Art of São Paulo. and it is installed in an architectural complex created in the 50s by the architect Oscar Niemeyer and his team. And the collection of the museum is around 10,000 works, including paintings, three-dimensional photographies, conceptual art, objects, and installation. So our focus was artworks produced between 1920 to 1950. This is the period related to the constitution of modernism, often described as the first counter-hegemonic aesthetic in Latin America. And then following this, following the post-colonial studies which have been questioning this approach, we decided to confront both collections by compiling a series of data sets organized according to some recurrent themes and in historical painting and Brazilian modernism. So indigenous people, people of color, white people, and tropical nature. Gisele, please.
Thank you, Bruno. First of all, I apologize. I'm recovering from COVID, so I'm a little bit slow, and sorry for my voice too. Continuing what Bruno is presenting, I should stress that our research process began as a kind of pedagogic experiment. It was and it is the Demonumenta project. It began in the context of the coronavirus pandemic with 70 students from the Faculty of Architecture, Urbanism and Design of the University of São Paulo. Basically, Demonumenta investigates the coloniality embedded in public institutions, monuments, and museum collections. And for this research, we organized our own network of people to do the tagging process for the AI experimentation. The decision-making process from the categorization to the tagging was collective. This is very important to stress, because the students were able to exchange knowledge and information, questioning and rethinking choices through this process, contradicting in some ways the precarious mode of machine learning in the AI field that, as you all know, usually is based on remote workers provided by services such as Amazon Mechanical Turk platform. The last thing I would like to stress that our focus was artworks produced between the 20s and the 50s, because this period is related to the constitution of modernism, which is, as Bruno already said, often described as the first counter-hegemonic aesthetic in Latin America.
Yes, so continue,
Bruno, yes.
Okay, thank you, Gisele. So to create our data sets that Gisele is explaining, we jointly and critically choose 50 categories to tag the museum's artworks. And for them, we define our final categories. It's sky, fauna, flora, Black people, white people, and indigenous people. And those categories correspond to confluent actions present in the Brazilian historical painting and in Brazilian modernist approach. So here I will change some of our results with AI. Following the post-colonial thought studies, we decided to both collections by compiling these data sets and then create some images using a model of algorithms that the name is GANs. And this choice of specific categories allowed us to deconstruct some basic assumptions of art historiography, which usually has its point of departure based on styles, for example, modern, contemporary, classic, etc., typologies, painting, sculpture, installations, etc., and authorships. By identifying the same categories in the collection of an historical museum, the Paulista Museum, and in the Museum of Contemporary Art, MACBA, it was also possible, based on the critical use of AI, to comprehend these continuities and discontinuities behind the models of artistic representations. So that choice also lead our tagging too often. No, okay, so this is not important. I think, Giselle, you can continue, please.
Okay, from these experimentations with GANs, those the data sets that we built allowed us to identify some common elements and differences between the Paulista Museum collection, this historical collection, and the Museum of Contemporary Art collection, despite the authorships or typologies of traditional art history. Through machine learning techniques, we could understand the persistence of the colonial imagination in the artworks, contradicting some canonical statements about Brazilian modernism, aesthetic and ideological ruptures. And these continuities range from the nude black male body, usually associated with plantation and slavery work, the patriarchal features of the white man, usually portrayed alone and with formal clothes, to indigenous people portrayed as generic entities without any particular characteristics. This is really something amazing, how it appears in the images we processed with GANs, the way how the indigenous group has no differences between men, women, children, old, young people. So this also repeats, also there are changes and they are evident in the figuration of white women, while historical painting focuses exclusively on their faces. In the modern painting, we see it emphasizes the woman's body. However, it's always understood from a misogynist point of view, emphasizing the woman breast and belly, elements directed that are related to motherhood. In what concern to women or Black women, the stereotype of the sensual slave is dominant in the collections we analyzed.
Okay, so because AI technologies read images by images, they can reveal hidden patterns in the iconography sets, including paintings, engravings, and drawings, going beyond traditional categories based on historical narratives and formal style. So the images we present here are the results of our ongoing investigation. They reflect how artificial intelligence understood the thematic axis of our analysis, revealing layers of meaning that traditional classification and organization approaches in the field of art history are not capable of evaluating. In this way, the composite collection proposed an artistic methodology that works as a counter-hegemonic performance. Our project also indicates how the practices of categorizing things and looking from a distance is structural for the colonial project, are related to AI practices. Michel Foucault wrote that taxonomy is not only a technology for giving names of things, but a methodology that supposes a certain continuum of things. And we believe that these images created in the composite collection show precisely this continuation. Kate Crawford also reminds us that this classificatory continuum of taxonomy is not just a movement in itself, but it is an instrument of power. So our experimentations shows that using AI researchers can contribute to critical analyze that traditional methodology in art history are not capable of evaluating. At the same time, these same images synthesized with neural networks reveal their limits for dealing with social otherness and the diversity intrinsic to individual creative procedures. Because of GAN's dependency on existing patterns, the training process points to generic visions and tend to reproduce the stereotypes of the colonial imaginary reframed by digital technologies.
I think that we are on time to close, so I would stress that from this perspective, the composite collection project operates in an intermediary field between historical colonialism and the emerging data colonialism. AI and its uses in computer vision are imbricated and embed many colonial projects underway since the 18th century, which includes statistical process, pattern decisions based on patterns, and the division of the colonial territories. So from machinic eugenics from one side and contemporary post-colonial thinking from another drove us in this project, not as a counterpoint between nature and culture, but in the direction that artificial intelligence opens up to thinking about kind of a next nature, less anthropocentric and normative. I think that we can close now, Bruno.
Yes, thank you very much for everything. And this project, we are also, as I said at the beginning, we are doing an installation of some of the results in the exhibition at ZKM, Biomedia exhibition. And the exhibition is open until August of this year. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I think you put it all on this in the chat, right? So we can copy and paste it into our.
Okay,
numbers.
I will.
Thank you. Was there any other thing on the chat that you?
Yeah, I'm just checking now because I didn't want to open. Okay, it is.
Any questions in the room?
It's disappeared. I was checking the chat.
Everybody's getting tired. They have time almost there. Yeah, already set up. That's Natalia is looking for questions via the chat, maybe. If there are any questions, that's
yeah, I'm not seeing any questions here, just some comments about some technical issue that was not.
No, that's not your problem. There is a question.
Thank you so much for the presentation. I was wondering, very curious about computer colonialism that you saw in images using AI algorithms, and I was wondering what do you know about the algorithms that you use and what kinds of training models did you use, and how do you think that relationship between algorithm is with the colonialization subject that you're looking at?
Okay, thank you. I think it is for the last, about the last project, right? Okay, and can you, did you, yeah, did you hear the question, Giselle and Bruno?
I
So,
couldn't
did you?
hear, but I could read here. I don't know if it's the same because the sound comes with a lot of
Yeah.
distortions. There is a question from Amy Alexander that I would be happy to answer, but I don't know if it is the same. I see here in the questions and answers.
No, this was here in person. Yeah.
I'm happy to just quickly.
Can you
summarize.
hear?
Can you
She's
hear me okay?
Yes, now I can. Yes, now you can. You can, Gisele? Can you?
For now, yes.
Okay.
Was just curious about the training model that you used for the AI algorithms in terms of determining the computational colonialism that exists in images that you researched.
Can anyone react to that?
Can you?
I missed, I think, the end of the question. And Natalia, I think that will be more clear for us if you repeat the question,
Yeah.
because coming from the audience, this
Yeah.
will
Okay, yeah, maybe
the
it's
sound,
better if
the transmission.
Would you mind to speak here in the microphone here, because they are not.
Okay, we have a little bit of.
Yeah. So sorry. Was just wondering, curious about the training model that you used when using the AI algorithm. What kinds of the relationship between that training model and the colonial lens that you're looking at in the images that you compared?
Okay, about the training model, maybe Gisele can answer more, but I don't know if we are clean in the presentation, but first we create our own data set with the artworks. So this was something very important for us. I know that maybe the data is not enough to train a gigantic AI or something like this, but the experience of doing this tagging process and the data set was very important for us, and shows that we think to be attention in terms of which kind of data we are using and how can we are tagging these images.
I hope that answers your question for now, because we really don't have time to go into this deeper, but I'm sure that you can have face-to-face communication too. I'm happy that still exists also. We already, this panel, I want to thank you very much for the panel. Very interesting.
Thank you, Bruno. Thank you, Sally.
Thank you.
This is the panel we already approached the, I don't want to say the highlights of the summit, but a subject that has been maybe underrated a little bit so far in the last summit and now. And that's the ethical issues that are connected to archiving new media art. And Lisa is Demo, is this the way I pronounce your name? Lisa Demo will give a short introduction, and then the roundtable about the subject. We're all invited to participate in, so it will be, the floor will be yours. After that, Wong who organized most of this together with Searleman, who is following all this from California. They took those two women did most of the work. And Bonnie will round it up after the panel, and we will try to be in time to go to the performance. Will be downstairs. Lisa, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you, everyone. Thanks for the invitation. Also, thank you for sticking around, for your patience and perseverance. My paper takes the Vimeo archive of the Syrian film collective Abu Nadara as a case study to address ethical issues that permeate the presentation of openly accessible online archives in the context of art exhibitions, particularly archives that pertain to conflict and violence. And I want to approach this topic from a very self-reflective perspective that I hope to also carry into the roundtable afterwards, to question patterns of recognition and representation that actually might reproduce the very power structures we try to criticize. So yeah. I also just want to mention, especially for everyone who's joining online, that I have some blank black slides in the presentation. It's not a mistake. So in the wake of the 2011 Arab uprisings, the widespread hope in the democratic potential of the digital generated numerous crowdsourced archival initiatives that set out to challenge authority over historiography and memory commanded by state institutions as well as global news networks. Yet, while the internet has enabled recording, sharing, and archiving these revolts in an unprecedented fashion, they also instituted a globally dispersed reinforcement of power, turning memory and knowledge into commodified and copyrighted goods. As Donatella Della Rata argues, the online platforms that enabled the emergence of such counter-archives also lodge them in informational economies that inflect their liberatory potential and render dissenting subjects and documents vulnerable to various forms of power, end quote. Against this background, as researchers, curators, archivists, artists, and viewers, it is essential to develop practices of engagement that can respond to the growing demands and responsibilities inherent in new media art archives of conflict and violence. Violence never becomes explicitly visible, but resonates through this 2-minute video interview by the Syrian film collective Abu Nadara. The boy presumably sits in a schoolyard. His name and location remain unknown. With great enthusiasm, he begins to recount how he and his friends started shouting revolutionary slogans in class and organizing demonstrations at school. When they joined the revolution, as he puts it, they started playing tricks like placing banana skins in the pathways of pro-regime teachers and performing subversive gestures like burning the portrait of Bashar al-Assad. But with the increasing militarization of the Syrian conflict and the transition from uprising to civil war, the boy's involvement also becomes more violent and dangerous. He boasts of his knowledge of weapons and his experience with guns. The whole conversation is repeatedly drowned by the noise of gunfire and the sound of an approaching engine, which prompts the camera to pan upwards and nervously scan the sky. The boy assures the interviewer that there is nothing to worry about. Just before the engine roar swells and the image cuts off with the sound of an airstrike. The video is titled "The End of School." Since its foundation in Damascus in 2017, an undisclosed number of volunteer self-taught filmmakers have gathered in the collective Abu Nadara to produce short videos which are freely accessible on the platform Vimeo. The name Abu Nadara translates to the man with glasses, both a hint towards seeing clearly and a reference to Dziga Vertov's Man with a Movie Camera. Violence rarely becomes explicitly visible, but resonates in conversations with commonplace protagonists, as well as through collages of news broadcasts and archival footage. By appropriating the aesthetic and formal language of documentary film, Abu Nadara seeks to make visible everyday life amidst the Syrian conflict and on the routes of refuge and migration. One such video is Children of Hellfire. In this video too, the main protagonist is a boy who talks about his experiences in the war in Syria and in exile in Lebanon. In Syria, he and his brothers and sisters went to school until the school was destroyed by a bomb attack. The camera zooms out and focuses on the other children of the family, looking both excitedly and embarrassedly into the camera. Gradually, the living conditions become apparent as they are housed in a refugee tent with mattresses, blankets, and rugs gathered around a central stove. The camera focuses on the boy again as he begins to talk about the Breadline Massacre. through which his hometown, Halfaya, just a few kilometers north of Hama, attained tragic fame. On 23rd of December 2012, about 300 civilians were killed in an airstrike as they were waiting in line for bread. As one of the most documented targeted attacks on civilians by the Assad regime, the Breadline Massacre became the focus of media attention. Remembering how he witnessed the massacre on television and on cell phones, a spark of pride enters the boy's face and gruesome account, a remnant of the expectations and hopes attached to the documentation of war crimes by citizen journalists. Abu Nadarah's films are the antithesis of the amateur footage from the Syrian conflict, which is characterized by shaky camera work, low resolution, poor sound quality, and the depiction of a moment of intense violence or emotion. The economy of news gathering and instrumentalization of citizen journalism that went hand in hand with the militarization of the Syrian conflict. Through the display of an increasing level of violence and suffering, and I quote Abu Nadarah, the Syrian has been transformed from a dignified revolutionary into a victim who provokes only sorrow or disgust, end quote. Accordingly, this has led to an unprecedented banalization of evil that leaves the audience barely a choice between indifference and compassionate voyeurism. As self-proclaimed artisans of cinema, the collective is very consciously practicing a type of careful, considered narrative that privileges storytelling over information. Abu Nadarah asserts that if Syrian image makers want to reinstate the dignity of their compatriots, they must seize the means of production of their own image, end quote. Yet, that was too fast. Yet, Syrian citizen journalists who filmed and shared their footage online, firmly believing in the distributed ownership of digital networks, later had to realize that they were no longer keepers of their own images. As soon as the revolutionary moment faded away, the revolutionary commons was also exposed to disruption and looting. The Syrian image was highly commodified and sought after by corporate and private actors, from broadcasting stations to NGOs, art galleries, and film festivals. In this image economy, Abu Nadarah constructed a digital archive to collect and preserve memory by way of building a different narrative, one that stands in opposition to that of the dictatorial regime and the news industry. Thus, ownership, authorship, and authority are key concerns for Abu Nadarah's work. However, in 2017, the Triennale Milano featured Abu Nadarah's video art archive as part of the exhibition La Terra Inquieta, The Restless Earth, even though the collective had explicitly declined this invitation. The refusal was grounded in the fact that the collective considered the Triennale's focus on Syrian migrants and refugees as opportunistic and did not want the work, quote, to be subsumed under a politico-aesthetic discourse which privileges a Western point of view, end quote. Nevertheless, the Triennale presented video loops of Abu Nadarah's work on 3 screens, including the 2 videos I showed at the beginning, The End of School and Children of Halfaya. When the collective became aware of this through press reviews, they asked for video screens to be removed, a request that was only granted after public outcry. Curator Massimiliano Gianni insisted that the exhibition simply made available monitors connected to Abu Nadarah's Vimeo archive, which was already in the public domain anyways. While Gianni acknowledged the ways in which Abu Nadarah reframes issues of authorship and distribution, he questioned their position on maintaining control over the videos, and I quote him, that is more restrictive than their own work would seem to suggest, end quote. As a consequence, Abu Nadarah decided to take their entire Vimeo archive offline. To this neglect of authorship and abuse of copyright by the Triennale, the film collective could not resign, quote, except to renounce our fight for the right to the image. Following this incident, so Abu Nadarah in an interview, we realized that the aesthetic struggle could not succeed without questioning the regime of representation in a juridical sense as well. In their 2014 concept paper for the coming revolution, Abu Nadarah claims a right to the dignified image, a transnational civil protection that the collective wishes to see amended to the United Nations Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Image rights for Abunadara are not aesthetic abstractions or artistic provocations, but concrete ethical concerns and legal realities. They argue that the right to the image is not a single right, but rather a bundle of rights, including the right to self-determination, the right to privacy, the right to freedom of opinion, and freedom of expression. Underlying the collective's conceptualization of the right to the dignified image is the claim for an alternative socio-economic system whose mainstream media would not depend on economic profit. It advocates a media that does not represent, by either economic or ideological necessity, some lives and bodies is more inclined to injury or death so as to maximize their currency as sensationalism. The collective demands that, quote, a balance of power must be constructed that allows Syrians to re-establish their own image separate from the political and media powers that seek to represent them. To achieve this, there should be a public debate about the invulnerability of the body and the right to self-determination in this media age. Essentially, the case of Abunadara serves as a mirror image of our representational apparatus, extending the hegemonic viewing patterns that underlie global news networks to international exhibition circuits. Thus, the Triennale reproduced the very power structures it sought to criticize, reflecting the processes that perpetuate spectacles of indignity and that fold us as global viewers into complicity with conflict and violence. I cannot purport to occupy a position outside of this digital sensorium that makes such patterns of viewing possible. Liberal societies are sustained by an uneven distribution of pain between those who suffer and those who are solicited to redress that suffering. Christina Sharp argues that the circulation and repetition of images of violence, as well as their formalization in art practices, do not lead to a cessation of violence, but often work to solidify and perpetuate the colonial project of violence. She urges us as distant viewers to think about what these images call forth, to think through what they call on us to do and to feel, and how we might be able to refuse the positions that these cruel images solicit. The technologies of war connect us across the globe through virtual networks and everyday digital environments and create infrastructural proximities. In many ways, by liking, sharing, tapping on our screens, we are in relations of touch with others, with our touch having very real consequences, even with those who cannot touch us back. Now more than ever are we in relationships of moral, affective, and material intimacy with distant conflict and violence, to the extent that we are always embedded and sensorially implicated in the cruel images they convey. This is to say that our relationship to conflict and violence goes beyond the question of seeing or looking away. In an intensely and extensively mediated global world, we're always in relation with these images, even if we do not see them. To challenge hegemonic and algorithmic infrastructures of knowledge production and dissemination, a still growing number of crowdsourced archival initiatives from the 2011 Arab uprisings claim the right to intervene in and act upon the reservoirs of collective memory. The space of image production and reception can expose epistemological gaps in digital and datafied repositories, centralize what has been abstracted, and reconfigure what counts as an archive. By doing so, we can imagine new forms of accountability from within the aesthetic field. This prompts us to reconsider our spectatorial positionality in archival agency. As viewers who look and listen, like and share, we can hide behind neither the screens in which we watch, nor the excuse that the recording was already out there. In looking, in listening, in liking and sharing, we are complicit. Thus, we need to ask, what are we looking at or listening to? How are we being asked to look and to listen? And is this a position we wish to take up? In other words, how can we develop an ethical practice vis-a-vis the subjects who are inscribed in such archival recordings? And these are some of the questions that I want to take into the roundtable discussion that I'm going to moderate now with Natalia. So, thank you.
Very impressive. We will do the roundtable. Since we can only begin to touch the subject, I think. I hope we can at the next summit, for which we still look for people who want to help organize it, because we are not going to do it. We will help, but we're not, cost us half a year of work that we will put into our archive, and Wong is not available next year for this. So if I'm serious about this, if you know anyone who would like to participate in organizing the next summit, let us know. Okay, so yours. I mean, it's all yours.
Thank you.
Yeah, do we have a traveling mic as well?
Oh, sorry. Yes, of course. That's a good suggestion.
Okay, good.
It's on.
Okay. I mean, I also do want to invite any feedback or comments from my presentation, but I mean, mostly I think this is I should start by saying that I felt like an intruder a lot of the time during this conference, because I have a background in art history and I know very little about technology and the digital in the end. But I've learned a lot, and I especially learned a lot about digital tools and infrastructures that could actually help us put in place ethical practices and methods of holding ourselves accountable. So I don't want this to be an abstract discourse about ethics. Natalia and I were very clear about that while we were preparing for this roundtable. We do consider ethics as a practice and not a code of conduct or a means to an end. And that's why ethics also needs to be constantly renegotiated in relation to the subjects that we're engaging with and the materials that we're engaging with. And I think very key to our understanding of ethics was that we're all equally responsible as viewers and listeners in this practice.
Yeah, I can continue. Maybe we can we separate some case studies. I know it's not the intention maybe to do another presentation, but I think it is maybe easier if we can share some examples to have more concrete things to discuss. But I think that would be interesting because you just finished your presentation, that we can continue about some ethic discussion that it's also related with this example, as maybe, I don't know, maybe we can open with one questions that that we finished the notion of digital literacy. How do you think maybe this aspect could be applied in this example? How do you think that considering both the audience of the Triennale and the event itself, how do you think that if we have more visual digital literacy in about this could happen in a different way? Maybe I'm just starting with a question to you, and that could open to another discussion.
Because I think also because I have a background in art history, I have a very clear position on that. I think it's shameful for the Triennale that it took so long for them to take down these videos, and especially, they asked Abunadara about their participation and invited them. Abunadara declined that invitation, and they nevertheless showed these images. So I don't think there is any way to defend that position. And even though it is in the public domain, they have artistic rights and also moral rights to not have their images repurposed for this narrative of the Triennale about Syrian refugees and migrants. Actually, I think I would quite like to turn this a very broad question to all of you. What kind of ethical concerns that you have encountered in your practices? I hope that this can be a space that in which we can learn from each other and sort of raise questions and concerns and insecurities. I am reproducing, so one of my insecurities, I'm reproducing these images here. I haven't asked for permission to do so. So that is very clearly also a violation of the right to the image. And perhaps while I'm posing this very broad question, Natalia and I, we also collected some key terms for the discussion. I'm just going to skip through all of that. That might help us think about these questions.
Hi, thank you for your presentation. It was very interesting both. I'm an artist too, so I have an artistic background, not technological. I'm like you, so for me it was very interesting everything. But I thought about appropriation, my artist form appropriation. I think about that a lot, and I think that ethics. You say you have the artistic rights and the ethic rights. So the artistic rights, they're ruled by laws. Each country has their own laws. So they are not the same all the world. And the ethics rights, each person has the ethics rights. So there's not the same in each person. So that's the point. I think you can join it. It's very difficult. It's very difficult. You have to ask for the conscience of the people. I don't know if it's. I think you're right.
I think that's 100% true. And I also think questions of consent are not applicable anymore because they are differently ruled in every country. So, and I think this idea of ethics then is very related to literacy, right?
Yeah.
There's a hand over there. Okay.
I found it really interesting when you were talking about ethics as, and maybe misunderstood, not necessarily a code of conduct, but like a performative act. And it made me think a lot about Amy Alexander's talk and talking about code as necessarily a performative template, right? That the code exists, but in order to enact the work, it must be performed, it must be run. And thinking a little bit about the platform that Dawn wrote and ways that we can attach desired usage for these digital objects. And in the way that there's different creative licenses, right? The kind of Creative Commons, or these like more standards that are moving more universally. And wondering if in the code itself, in the platform itself, that there is an ethical need to provide these types of preferences for people when they save an image, right? If I save a JPEG, I can talk about how I want it compressed and how I want, the pixels to look, but maybe some really quick and easy ways that we can embed in the metadata so that like an image, if it is shown outside of context and without consent, that there might be recourse for the owner of that image. It gets also kind of complicated too when we start thinking about images of people and how the people who maybe are not steeped in digital media literacy or image literacy would feel about that. But especially on social media platforms, like, I don't know what your total number was, 9 million or something images uploaded a day. These platforms know who's in the images, right? Like they know, they have facial recognition, they know. So I wonder if similarly, if I save an image, if I could embed, metadata in that content, it is totally possible that I am notified that an image of me gets uploaded and how I like that image to be used, right? It's possible, but the problem is we don't really have great ethics boards inside Adobe or Facebook or, Google tried, but I think, the ethics group was dissolved within a month or something. And so how do we create our own platforms? Is that the way forward? Yeah. And I know you're not technologists, which is why I kind of gave that broad, but
I mean, if anyone wants to respond to the question from the audience as well, the thing is, I want to shift responsibility from image producers to image spectators. I would hope that by advancing literacy, both visual and archival literacy, we would not be forced to include all kinds of metadata in images in order to control how they are being reproduced and for what purposes. One case that I'm engaging with is YouTube in 2007 introduced an algorithm that's taking down all videos that are considered to have terrorist content, which also implies all kinds of videos that document war crimes and human rights violations in Syria. And they could have been used as evidence in legal cases. So there's an initiative called the Syrian Archive, who've also developed an algorithm that is automatically downloading everything that's uploaded to YouTube, because these algorithms, they also can't be held accountable in the end, and it's humans behind these algorithms, right? So, yeah.
So if I understand you right, you don't see the solution in automated, you don't believe in automated solutions for this, because there maybe, is there a code of conduct necessary for the new media archives or archives in general? A code of conduct that we are really missing in the modern, that's related to the modern technological possibilities. Within the ISEA archives, we sometimes have discussions about what we can do and what we cannot do with data that's available on the internet. I think like it's public domain, I can use this image as long as I mention the source, but I cannot find the rules that I should stick to.
I'm skeptical about codes of conduct because they assume that there could be a rather standardized performance of how to deal with these images. Standardized.
Oh, standardized.
Sorry. And as we were saying before, it is very much specific to the context, the material, and the subjects that would redefine any ethical practice in relation to these images, I think. But I also saw that there was another comment in that question.
Yeah, can I just also add something, and which is also actually is more a question about. I also, in a way, I agree that is. I think it is make more sense to give the responsibility to the spectator, but even what's the limit of this visual literacy, this digital literacy, and it is also very it varies a lot depending on the context in which this spectator coming from. I don't see it in many contexts in some Latin American countries, countries in which digital is not so widespread yet. How this literacy could finally be achieved. So, how should we deal with this unbalancing also digital literacy and the limits of this? This is also, no response to this also.
You have a question?
Yeah, very quickly. No, it's remark. No, I hope it fits somehow. The thing is, if we very basically separate the technical level from the content somehow. I mean, on a technical level, of course, we can always copy an information. I mean, the digital and electronic media are born because the information can be copied. So we should take, I think, this into account when we think about whatever protocol. Of course, Creative Commons was a standard, very widely adopted, but as we know, you can't stop somebody to copy something and to use it. Then you have to act on a different level, which is the legal somehow, if you want to. And the source, I think it's a very key point. This should be the first, let's say, act in terms of respecting the source and pointing to the source all the time, because then I can verify the information and who has produced it in the first instance. And we all know that especially on social media, the sources are disappearing because it takes just that little bit amount of time that most people don't have or don't care about, which is also a thing which I think it's very crucial to discuss. But I wanted to ask especially to the art historian this specific question, because on one side the framework was the other main thing that was, I think, that emerged. So what is the framework? And then we discuss, we judge, we act upon. And we have the museum, like the classic, the biggest framework on one side, and the street, let's say, passing of information through digital devices on the other. I was thinking, there's any case in art history, or I mean, there's any kind of organization, bottom-up organization, like creating, let's say, their own popular cheap museum that would defend, let's say, or make it official, a collection of images or information that then is created and officialized outside the institutional framework.
I think that's more a question for you, Natalia.
I don't know, we can start because maybe
Can I ask something?
Yeah, I think what's interesting, okay, what you are saying, that how we cannot also predict the use of something that we are archiving in the future, right? And because it could be used for several purposes, and I would say that even if we can be responsible of what we are archiving and to not use this in a different, unethical way, we cannot be guaranteed, because it is a very unconscious and also like this idea of counter collector, the people could became by chance a collector. They are not doing this on purpose, and also they are not doing something that is not ethical on purpose. So but I think that I also don't think that a code of this, it is possible to expect this from companies, from museums. I still think that it's individual, but at the point that we don't know, even also individual would change in the future, would be very, it cannot, I don't have an answer for this.
Yeah, we have the difference between the code and the law. I mean, the people that are willing will stick to the code, and the people that are not willing don't stick to the code, and then you have the law. It's somewhere in between that you have to look for solutions. But you can also make it an endless problem, and maybe it isn't a solvable problem.
I was worried that I would be sort of the party pooper at the end of the conference who addresses this endless problem. I think there is a fundamental difference between performing ethics and practicing ethics. And there are lots of museums who engage with, I would say, alibi gestures or whitewashing, for example, or greenwashing. And then, they follow a code, or laws. They definitely, most of them follow laws as well. But that doesn't mean that their practice is ethical. And I know that Ricardo has a question.
Ricardo has a question, and there is a question there. Let's go to Ricardo. By the way, we have 5 minutes left.
Yes. I just want to be sure if I misunderstood something that was said, that digital is not widely spread in Latin America. That was the sentence I understood.
No, not digital. Well, at least the access to internet. More access to internet. At least in Brazil, it is still the big majority of people don't have access only on cell phones, and it's still, I don't have the number here, but it's not, it is still limited, although it is a very contradiction, because it's a very digital country, but it's still, like in the pandemic, this was much more clear, like especially on education, that many students didn't have like high speed access to internet, and so there's still a gap in the access for many people.
But I think the sentence was more related to literacy, right? That
yeah, but it's also, yeah, if you don't have like a access, the literacy also would be compromised, I think. Yeah.
If you allow me, just briefly, I think that in Latin America, yes, there are restrictions, but most people have access to internet through phones, as you were saying. But I work mostly in Canada, and in Canada, many of my students have problems to access to internet, even on their phones. So it's not just in Latin America, because given that sentence that in Latin America we have those kind of restrictions, it sounds like a little bit, even if you live in Brazil, it looks like the typical speech about colonialism and the central countries, where everything related to media art is happening in certain places, and then other places are the poor places where we don't have access to this and that. I don't believe in that, to be honest. Thank you.
That's a good remark, Ricardo. We have a question here. Go ahead.
Okay,
Remark.
yeah, I love the presentation, and I was thinking again the role of the archive and the archivist, and it's not exactly to tell the stories, but to prepare the material to so that these stories can be told. So, archivists, we are working in a permanent contradiction, because we want to tell things or we see things, but our job consists in stay distant of these things all the time. And I was also thinking on the term, if I'm not wrong, in English they speak about custodians, the people working in the archive, and it's everything for me. It's kind of taking care of the objects, and here preservation have another role, and it's about this care. And I'm thinking this care cannot work without empathy. So you have to empathize with the objects, which can be somehow strange, but especially with the people that give these objects to the archive to preserve them. And somehow there is one idea, and it's the idea of conflict, and we have to face it somehow, because there will always be conflict between what some people want to do with some material, what some other people want to do about this material. And your case was kind of clear because the author was expressing their desires, but sometimes you don't have the author, you cannot read, or you cannot be sure, you only have part of the group and so on. So I think sometimes you have to be referee or something like that in the middle, and I just hope that people do the best they can do. There is no criterion, but I think it's just kind of personal code or something like that. You cannot really put a line on there. Yeah. I want to say.
It's a point. I think it's more or less what I also, you called it party poo-poo.
No,
No, it is a problem we need to discuss, that's clear, but the solution doesn't seem close by.
No, and I don't think maybe looking for a solution is the way to go, but being very sensitive about the questions and immediate responses that we feel towards archival material. I mean, I think archivists have several dimensions of responsibilities to the subjects inscribed in the records, to the producers of the material, and to the viewers, and that stretches from the past into the future, you know. So also one of a question that I also that came up for me during the presentations was about for whom are we actually archiving, and how does how does the accessibility, how does the archival architecture that we build foreclose or encourage accessibility and participation in that? And so, because building an archive is already a way of defining who we are archiving for, right? So it's not, that wasn't really a question, I'm sorry. But I mean, another term that, two things that also struck me was that content moderation seems to be an increasing question that comes up in many of the archival initiatives I've encountered today. And I'd be curious if anyone has any experiences with that, because GI was also talking about the Twitter archive from the 2020 election campaign in the US, and there must be, I mean, there must be a lot of violent content and hate speech in there. And I was wondering about content moderation in that. And then also the right to be forgotten. So how can we build this into our archival structures?
Good questions.
Perhaps also the question is there even a frontier now between an archive that is accessible and a diffusion platform? Because before it was, you know, two very different worlds, but suddenly, you know, there's no reason why you couldn't read archive.org differently than the web, and suddenly you could access everything. So yes, it raises all those questions.
Thank you. I find really interesting this reflection about how we are connected now, because mainly that's the point, and all the conflicts that can appear through this new point of view and this new reflection we can start to develop are really very nice. Thank you.
I'll conclude my remarks, my stories. Thank you very much for your talks. It was really inspiring to see, let's say, two dimensions of the discussion about like digitality and archives. One, let's say that the first part we had kind of classification, tagging, for instance, right? Or in the AI classification and processing, you know, as well, the algorithm performing, you know, the selections in the art pieces of the archives there in Brazil. And in the second, it was more about circulation and exhibition, right? Like the conflict between something that is already circulating on the internet and how that is eventually, you know, selected to be displayed in an art context. And in both cases, I found very profound reflections in your presentations. What I would like to see in both cases is kind of more examples of the same kind of work or problems that you're addressing in terms of having like better comparisons. Let's say, for instance, I remember probably in ISEA 2010, there was presentation about the early Arab Spring manifestations in Egypt. And at that time it was because the internet was closed down very quickly. There were like just remains of audio. It was mainly, you know, short pieces of audio, and many questions like what you're addressing now were part of the discussion, and it's been hidden for a while. I'm so happy to see that, you know, this is coming back, and I think, you know, having more examples kind of will help to develop like a stronger framework. And also in your case, I think they probably connection to like what you're doing with the tags of the museum and with what you sell and the team with Bruno is right are doing in Brazil. Sounds very promising, because in both cases I see there's a lot of room for elaboration. So I learned a lot. Thanks for the presentations, and I really enjoyed also the topics, you know, like I'd like to see like topics that we didn't touch that we do have in the presentation, like care. Eventually that would be interesting to have, you know, or
Okay.
Can we go back to the slides? No, right?
I think we can, but we're also running out of time.
There are a lot of really provocative words there. Thank you
I
so
think-
much for that.
Amy still has her hand raised.
Oh, Amy,
So-
please.
Oh, I was just going to respond to the question about content moderation, which I think is an interesting problem for how history that we're living through will be archived. I ran into this at the beginning of the pandemic. My project I mentioned briefly, What the Robot Saw, used to run on YouTube because YouTube archives things like forever, seemingly, as far as we know. Everything on YouTube gets archived indefinitely. And so I was trying to make this archive that would stream back to YouTube and archive itself indefinitely of YouTube underseen videos. But once the pandemic hit, according to YouTube's explanation, their human content moderators went home and they implemented a rather aggressive content moderation algorithm. And so all of my videos suddenly, for that project, suddenly were getting removed by the content moderation algorithm, which made me realize, and there was a lot of discussion among YouTube content creators about this over-aggressive algorithm that had been implemented. So it occurred to me, I just moved my project to Twitch, which has better looser moderation, but it also doesn't archive. But I started to think about all of the materials that, the content that was being uploaded to YouTube during that period that would have been documenting that period of our existence, our collective existence, indefinitely. And these were, many things were going to be deleted. And so if we expand upon that, we can think about how all of these algorithms are not only impacting what we see now, but how history will be archived. So I don't know if other people have thoughts about that or agonize at night about that, but it's something that I've been concerned with.
Yeah, I think that also responds to Elian's consideration whether web platforms or archives themselves. And I think we need to realize that web-based archives that are sort of owned by private companies and corporations are actually very precarious and endangered, and that we can't rely on these materials being archived indefinitely.
Yes, I would agree with that. And it's better to have them than not to have them, but I absolutely agree that the Google controlled archive is not a solution to begin with.
Thank you.
Yeah, can I just say something about what I think that is interesting. This makes influence between how social media are used as archive and museum are incorporating some practice that are collaborative that came from the hacker culture, which is this idea of maybe thinking about the relational ethics, how ethics could be created in a collective way. There are very interesting projects like what Bruno and Gisele are doing, but also some indigenous people who are doing with museums new process of taxonomies, intervene in the archives names of how these images are categorized in their archives. So I think it's a very good strategy to use this relation to appropriate the influence of the collaborative in a good way from social media through museums, and apply like a relational ethics that. Yeah, that's it.
I really wanted to join the conversation, but I have so many thoughts and stories that it would probably take us another hour, and there's a performance downstairs. So I have a few concluding remarks. First of all, I want us to give them a very big for just starting the conversation. Please please continue this conversation with others because it's a very serious issue. We've got to think about it very deeply. Okay, so I have a few concluding remarks. First of all, I want to thank all of you and all of the remote presenters that are here or not here, because without you, we wouldn't have this history alive today. So thank you so much, and thank you for sharing it with each other. I want to invite you to join the, yeah, there it is, join the Global New Media Art Archiving Group. We're starting this project. We're connecting archives from around the world. There'll be much more in-depth conversation about that Tuesday at 12:40. I want to also invite you and actually urge you to give us feedback or give Terry feedback, because he's doing a research study. He's a graduate student at Simon Fraser University, and he's right here. And his questions are quite provocative, and I really think it's going to help us really understand your thoughts on all of these questions. Okay, thank you, Terry, for doing that. I want you to give feedback on the future of ISEA. There are some yellow forms and black boxes right by the door. And right on the back, if you want, write on any piece of paper you can find and stuff it in the box, because there is going to be a roundtable. Hey, Wim, do you remember the exact time on that? I didn't write that one down. Roundtable? Oh, not my head. Well, me neither. He'll look it up real quick. So we're going to have a roundtable where you can give advice on what you think ISEA should be doing in the future. Okay, and we are looking for a lot of participation, so please come to that roundtable. Write your.
It's Monday. It's Monday at 4:30 until 6.
I've worked with him for. I've been working with him for years. So another thing is this symposium and this summit will be archived. And as you can see, we've been recording the event. I'm looking forward to those recordings because, quite honestly, I've been so wrapped up with the logistics, I haven't been able to give it my full attention, and I want to. And so I invite you afterwards to share the information that was shared here today and yesterday with folks. I don't know how soon we'll get that online, but please look at the ISEA archive, and you know, you'll be there, right? You're going to be part of history. And if you want your materials removed, we will do that. Okay. Do have the right to be forgotten. I have another thing. Oh, that brings me to another point, is we have been archiving all of the years of the symposium, and there's a lot of information that we're missing. And so please go into the archive, take a look. If your profile picture is not there, if your bio is not there, if one of the artworks or the presentations that you did was not there or misrepresented, please contact us. We really want to get it right. We're going to give a talk about the ISEA archive Tuesday at 5:30. So please join us, and we'll see a little bit more about what we've been doing. Now, before we conclude, I just want to first ask my colleagues, Tim and Terry, before I do my final thank yous. Is there anything else? Oh, should I give it back or not?
Yeah, that's not just whether your bio is there, but we specifically are missing images of early artworks. You know, since we have two versions of our archive: the classic one and a newer one. The new one has much more room for images and videos and audio. And the classic one is more text-based, and it's only there until the new archive is completely updated and checked for mistakes. Because, but the audio-visual material is what we really want. The bio.
Oh, of course. No, we are missing a lot of materials. I did forget something. There's a monitor downstairs, and it contains the 8 works that are in the art show that Terry and I sort of organized. I would say it was a juried show. And so please stop by and see some of the work. There's some really amazing pieces by some folks that are here today, and also some of our remote presenters. And all of that work is influenced or is focused on works in archives that they're responding to. So now I'm gonna get to the last part, and that is none of this would have been possible if it were not for the hard work of, can we get the people back up? The people involved in making this happen. Okay, so I'll start off with a special little treat here. Mart Omega, come on up. Come on up. I'm sorry, Augusti, wrong Marta. There's way too many Martas we've been working with. Oh, you've been awesome too. No, Marta Augusti. Did I pronounce your last name right?
It's Marta.
Oh, Magay. I just know her, Marta. We've been meeting with her twice a week. And this woman is amazing because she dealt with all the difficult issues, okay? And so thank you so much. Mart Omega, though, was on the art jury for the show, and also is very involved with helping, make ISEA happen. So thank you, Marta. The next person that deals with, we had a conversation over lunch about, what is the most difficult part? Dealing with the people, that is, getting the bios, getting the pictures, getting things on time, the papers written right, or dealing with the technology. Now, Anthony thinks it's the technology, and he deserves a little treat. It's been running the technology back there. Now, I want to just tell you a quick little story. SIGGRAPH, the ISEA Symposium, would not touch this idea of doing a hybrid event. It's too technically difficult. There's challenges. SIGGRAPH tried it. First day was a major failure, okay? We have had a major success, and that's because of Anthony and his technology assistants here, the stage managers and the tech, people jumping up here, changing the slides. So I just want to thank the whole team. And last but not least, I want to thank my colleague and my collaborator on so many projects. Her and I have been meeting every day for the last few months. This is Jan Searleman. Jan, can you say a few words?
This has been an absolutely remarkable 2 days. Although I'm separated from you all by thousands of kilometers and a 9-hour time difference, I have so thoroughly enjoyed seeing you and hearing the many diverse approaches and ideas and projects in new media art archiving. And I hope that we find a way to continue this conversation throughout the year. And if I could just also add, before I say a final thank you, there is also a long paper that Bonnie, Vim, Terry, and I will be presenting on interconnecting new media art archiving worldwide. And that's also on Tuesday. So thank you all.
Now just how dedicated this woman is. What time did you get up to attend the summit?
Well, my time, it starts at 1 a.m. So I had some very sleepless nights the last 2 days.
She's been there the whole time. It's amazing. So, and then last of all, Terry and Wim, come up here. Oh, Wim's hiding in the back. You've seen enough of him probably, huh? No, these guys, we meet multiple times every week. And we have been for years building the archive and putting together this summit. We are a real tight team. We work really well together and we've accomplished a lot, I think. So I just want to thank both of you guys.
Yeah, thank you.
Oh, tell them about the performance.
Downstairs is a performance starting right now.
And I hear it's amazing.
But they postponed it so that you could go to the toilet.
I want to copy the